Well, it's June 30th. I made a video this morning and I was talking a little bit about how this is the weekend coming up of 4th of July. 4th of July is on Tuesday. And how important freedom is and how important the U.S. Constitution is. It's one of the most well thought out and I guess magnificently planned government structures of the history of mankind, and it has so many different levels. And the individual, it starts with the individual, and that's one of the real key aspects to the U.S. Constitution. And the Constitution is essentially, that is the country. So the country is 50 states with the citizens of those states all brought together by this Constitution. And the Constitution is really what forms what we call the federal level of government. And so under the Constitution we have not only individual rights that are protected and that the states must abide by. So the states are not supposed to infringe on the constitutional rights of their citizens, but other than that, the states have a pretty good amount of freedom within them for the citizens of each individual state to kind of decide how they want their state to operate, as long as it doesn't infringe on the Constitution. And if they are doing something that the citizens think or infringes on the Constitution, then that can be taken to the federal level, and that can be heard in the federal courts. The federal courts can make a ruling on whether or not the states are within the bounds of the Constitution or not. So with that, it's so important that these individual rights form the foundation. If you just skip the individual rights, and let's say you moved up to just the rights of, say, a city or a county, nothing would work properly under the American Constitution. It's that foundation and the individual liberties that allow the whole thing to work. So it's a check and balance system all the way from the individual all the way up to the White House. And so the federal government has three main branches, at least originally in the Constitution. Some would say that some branches have been added, but not necessarily as constitutional. So it's a problem, but that's a story for another day. But the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch are the three federal branches of government, and they all check and balance each other. They all have ability to, the legislative branch makes the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws, and the executive branch enforces the laws. So like the Department of Justice and etc. The executive branch also oversees that's the commander-in-chief, and oversees the military action at the federal level. And then the Congress has the ability to oversee the executive branch in terms of being able to hold the executive branch accountable, so to speak. And the judicial branch holds the congressional branch accountable, so to speak. And and then the executive branch, of course, appoints judges and that sort of thing. So the states usually operate under a very similar structure to the federal government, but the states in and of themselves form a check and balance against the federal government. So there's states' rights, and the states, just like the federal government or the citizens of the states or whatever, can argue against the state's actions, so to speak, or they can challenge the state's actions under the Constitution. The states can do that back to the federal government as well. So there's a check and balance, a major check and balance between the states and the federal level government. And that's all very important. And then, of course, the individuals also have those rights to do that, have to enforce to have their rights heard against city and state and federal actions as well. And the towns also, which are very important because they act a lot like the citizens, very closely to the citizenship. So a lot of times if the towns can infringe or fight against the higher levels of government, or do things against the Constitution to the individuals, and vice versa, and etc. So they're all important. So all these different levels are very important in the way that it's structured, and everybody all has to come back and look back to the Constitution at the end of the day. And so that's what brings us all together. And the Declaration of Independence set in motion the events that led to the original signing of the Constitution, and then to the Revolution, and since then, the country has been through many trials and tribulations. Some that we forget today, were so major. Can you imagine what it was like living during the time of the Civil War? Which some of your ancestors buried in this graveyard were alive during the Civil War era, and what that must have been like. So many family members fighting against one another, and all of these things, and so much death and destruction, and it was it's just very hard for anybody to imagine what that would have been like now, on seeing that on American soil. But here we are, celebrating. It's easy, I think, for me to remember the age of the country because I was born in 1976, which is the 200-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So I just have to add my birthday to 200, and that's how old the country is. So 247 years. So pretty much soon we have the 250 coming up. That's a pretty big one, right? A couple more years we have the 250 coming up. So now the smoke in the sky. The reason we can't see the sun setting over the water the last few days is because of the big fires in Canada. Canada was also a British colony, but they obtained their independence from Britain much later, and more as a result of just the British Empire going into decline. When the states, when the United States of America declared its independence, Great Britain was on the rise when they were expanding their empire at that time, and probably had the strongest navy in the world. It's probably I don't know. I think Spain was already pretty well in Spain had already lost, I think, most of its armada, which was which during the early days of colonization of North America by the Europeans was the strongest. Spain was the strongest country, but that was in the 1500s, so a good bit before America declared its independence. By the time America declared its independence, England was the strongest country in Europe, and was still growing its empire at that time. Very interesting history. It's good to learn about those things because you can kind of compare that all people have gone through all sorts of things that kind of add up to where we're at today, and the things that we do today will add up, be part of the addition to what happens in the future. And we're learning so much about science and in combination with physics, and I think we're now, and of course computer science, which with artificial intelligence is just That's a change like nobody's ever seen before. So that's going to define a lot of your life. It's what happens in the realm of computer science, quantum mechanics, and artificial intelligence. But I think it's very interesting. Some of the theories that are now coming out of quantum theory are being merged with quantum theory, where we're maybe finally scratching the surface on some theories of information and the mind and how consciousness may work in a it's just the very, very early beginnings of in modern science. But a lot of it points back to what the ancient people thought of. But the ancient people didn't have the mathematics and the physics and the computer science to define it under our modern day standards. But there's been a real sense in cultures that stood the test of time over thousands of years of humanity, or that there's this idea of a spiritual world, and that's somehow connected to our mind and the consciousness, and that's kind of like a field. And now they're kind of starting to sort of tease out the idea that that's maybe kind of all tied together with the quantum field, and the quantum mechanics is so much different than the large scale world that Einstein's theory of relativity explained, and kind of pulling all that together. So I think that's a lot of what your generation's going to be influenced by. But it's still all connected back to some higher thing, some connectiveness of humanity and God, and still doesn't rule out the message that Jesus brought to try and pull mankind together and try to unify people under this idea of oneness and brotherly love and all that kind of thing, which has a lot to do with the founding of the United States. There's principles along with the ancient pre-Christian principles. So it's kind of interesting how the United States was formed with these principles of an enlightened period that brought out a lot of these new philosophies from Europe that couldn't be easily implemented in an old world Europe. But it also took from the best of the ancient world, the Greeks especially, and the Romans, and how they structured their governments, and freedom of the citizenry and that sort of thing. And then, of course, there was but by the time the United States came along, unlike Greece and ancient Greece and Rome, and ancient Rome, there wasn't the Christian philosophy to add into that. So we have a lot of the Christian teachings built into our government system as well, which kind of smoothed out a lot of the way that especially the way that the justice system worked back in the old days. The Greeks and the Romans had a very, and a lot of Europe still, but especially until just very recent times, still used a lot of the continental Europe, a lot of a lot of the principles of the pre-enlightened principles and the pre-Christian principles in the judicial system, which were very harsh. It's not to say that America's not doing a lot of harsh things in our judicial systems, but at least the principles that we're based on can pull a lot of people out of that, and we can correct a lot of our wrongs because at least it's in our foundation to we just have to use those things. Like, we have to actually stand by those principles and not dismiss them. And so the big one is innocent until proven guilty. That was a major change in the way that justice was served, and that actually started being implemented in Britain. And so the British judicial system was quite a bit different than the continental European judicial system in that respect. Anyways, it's a long video. Yeah, the sun's coming back. How about that? Let's see, it's over the water, just a little bit off of the longest day of the year, which is the first day of summer. So we're just a few days past that. I love you.